All right, thank you for staying with Daybreak. We're getting into that discussion now, and let's put up the questions so that you can also be involved in this conversation. 22422 is the SMS line, at Trevor Mbija, at Citizen TV Kenya, at Zinzi_K, hashtag Daybreak. Should the interest rate cap be repealed? This is coming in the backdrop where last week President Uhuru Kenyatta declined to sign the Finance Bill 2019 after revealing that the members of parliament had decided to retain the interest rate caps. So in the memorandum, President says that the interest rate cap put in place in September 2016 had caused unintended effects that are significant and damaging to the economy. So we'd like to hear your experience trying to access funding during this time. Let me introduce my guest real quick, beginning from my immediate left, and that is Mr. Victor Agola, SME consultant. Thank you for coming in this morning. And we have Robert Bwire, Ken Invest General Manager, Research, Policy and Planning. Asante sana for coming in. We also have Kwame Owino, he's an economist and also the CEO, Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you very much. And Honorable Moses Kuria, the Tundu South Member of Parliament. Thank you for making time this morning. And Honorable Kuria, I'll start with you. Is the President right when he says the interest rate cap caused unintended effects that are damaging to the economy?
Certainly, yes. Personally, I feel some sense of deja vu because I've been opposed to this cap right from 2016. I commented, I actually wrote publicly in the newspapers that time, that it was trying to cure a disease that was real, that was existing. It was not an imaginary disease. You know, banks had gone rogue, the interest rates were, you know, unbearable for most Kenyans. But using caps as a prescription for that was wrong. I did say that time that it looks good from far, but it's actually far from good. Other than even the consequences that the President did enumerate in his memorandum that he sent to Parliament, I think the bigger thing is that the caps actually remove the power of central bank to exercise monetary policy in a free way. By the way, even if central bank would have wanted to reduce the CBR, the central bank rate, it would not have, because you know that would have affected, you know, a whole, you know, lot, you know, the whole stock of existing loans. So I think that it is good to remove the caps. Yeah. I would have wanted to see a graduated formula for that removal, but that be it as it were. I've heard the banks cry out that the impact of the rate is that they cannot do risk-based pricing. I do agree. So I would have wanted also that this cap goes at a time when we have got a formula for differentiated risk-based pricing, whereby if I am riskier than you, then I have to pay a higher price. And this calls for mandatory credit scoring that is universal and that is shareable across all banks. But I think these are issues that we can be able to deal with. But at the moment, the biggest beneficiary is the SME, that SMEs will now be able to access loans. I do hope they are going to access loans. And what we had before the cap is that we had loans that were available but not affordable. Okay. Then after the caps, we had loans that were affordable but not available. Okay. So I do hope now that sense has prevailed, that you're going to see loans that are both available and affordable.
Okay, we'll get into the details in just a bit, but let's get a feeling of what the other panelists feel about this. Is the President right?
Well, yes. I mean, I wouldn't have put it in the same reasons that he has, but it, largely speaking, if the reason, or rather, the theory is that Parliament should not pass laws in vain. So if you pass a law and that law does not have the effect that was intended, it's just wisdom to actually revise it. And I think that's what the President is reminding parliamentarians. I have a problem with the procedure in the sense that we are using the finance law, which is basically a law that's supposed to be used to finance the budget, to actually come back here and revise this. But nevertheless, I think I was on record as well, it was not going to achieve what it did. I think especially because on the one side, you cannot say that banks should lend at a certain rate, and yet the government itself is free to borrow as much as it can and was wiping out everything from the market. So banks had no intention, had no incentive to lend to anybody else. So if you do not control those two parts, then it doesn't matter what you try to do. And obviously we are coming back, I think 2.5 years later, to realize that this wasn't the right policy. So it's going to have so many other effects because there are already loans in place. Yeah. And obviously, as you can tell with banks, they'll say what they'll do, But immediately, immediately after Parliament does what it needs to do, many more loans are going to go up, and you're going to hear those same problems that we had before. So it doesn't solve. It takes us back to where we were in 2016. But that's to say that we made a mistake. I think it's had unintended consequences, and the President has enumerated them in the memorandum.
Okay. Robert, should we have stuck to this?
I think the President was right. For many years, the government has been undertaking liberalization and quite a number of reforms that have placed the country in a strong position in the international investment era.
Yeah.
So by introducing caps, we are going back to controls again, which we are backtracking on reforms, which does not augur well for the country.
So we should not repeal it then, in your view?
Yes.
It should stay as is?
Yes.
Okay. Victor?
I think from an SME perspective, I feel that, in my opinion, SMEs are scapegoats, are being dangled as a carrot for the interest of cap. Why do I say this? In 2017, we did a study on access to finance for SMEs, and we were asking SMEs, how have you been financing your businesses prior and even after the rate cap? And if you look at based on the business model of banks, they are looking at collateral. A lot of SMEs don't have collateral. So a lot of them were financing, and even still up to now, financing through family, friends, chamas, and SACCOs. A lot of them walk away from banks based on the way banks are structured. So the idea of putting SMEs not being able to access finance, for me, is not an optimal reason for the rate cap discussion.
Mm-hmm. So, Owino, then, is there a way we can manage our interest rates a bit different than? What options do we have as a nation?
No, there's no way. I mean, the thing is that we understand that banks have a role to play, and their role, they play two roles. One of them is to just bring back, rather to mediate, which is basically to collect deposits and then to lend. As Honorable Moses Kuri has mentioned earlier, basically one of the ways it's done in a liberal market is that your bank provides you credit based on your ability to pay and the risk profile. So basically, if you're a more risky lender, then obviously your sources of credit will be limited, and that's it. One of the things that the government could do to make sure that there is moderation first is basically just regulatory control. So for instance, while the interest rates cap has been on, the way banks manage lending, even if you went in back, they tell you, well, there's for personal loans or any other things, there are many other fees that they introduced, to be honest, which actually cut away the fact that they had an interest rate cap. So for as long as they have that flexibility, I think there are two things that can be done. One of them is just proper oversight by the central bank, and I hope it takes that role to ensure that there's no abuse, because it's going to happen. Yeah. Knowing Kenyan banks, it's going to happen. Now, their unethical view doesn't mean that you can their unethical behavior doesn't mean you can do that by controlling caps. I think the anger, as Moses mentioned, was real. People thought that the abuse had taken place, and for that reason, he wanted to damn banks. So that's the first part. The second part is the public sector has to stop borrowing, because banks know if they know that the government is borrowing, say, 2 billion shillings every 2 weeks, they don't care what you do. If you go to them and you're applying for a facility, they'll tell you, and they're thinking, why should I give it to you at 13 when the government could take it at 9? Risk-free, basically sitting on a desk, sending the money to government and collecting their money off bonds and treasury bills every so often. So unless that part changes, where the government is not competing with enterprises for lending, this bill will just have passed for that reason, and it will not affect much in the market, to be honest.
All right, Owen, I want you to paint for me a picture for me, because right now, as a country, we are sinking in debt. It's quite obvious. We have a budget that is costing us about 3 trillion. Government says that it needs to borrow in order to sort of finance the next financial year. Our ceiling debt has now, or rather, could soon be increased to about 9 trillion. Which legally it's allowed, about what, 50% of our GDP, if memory serves me right. Nevertheless, if we do that, if we do continue borrowing as government says, and we increase our debt ceiling to 9 trillion, what does that do to the price of bread? What does that do to Mama Mboga and her business?
Well, okay, let's get our facts right first. The debt ceiling was 50% of GDP, and that's what's being revised. So they're taking out a revision that's based on a rate as a share of the GDP to a nominal figure, which is 9 trillion shillings, which is supposed to be the total. So the 50% will not apply anymore. Now, if you look at our debt, our size of our GDP today, the debt allowance that's been given if that is changed, would bring it close to 100% of GDP. In other words, we've bought some space, and there are reasons both ways and both ways. But for me, the point is not really to argue with those numbers. The point is what share of debt is Parliament? What share of domestic debt is first, but what share of debt is Parliament comfortable with, knowing that all debt represents taxes and they represent taxpayers. That's the most important thing. So that can change every year. It can be whatever it is, but what is it, and what are the domestic circumstances that make debt necessary or not? So that's the first one. And the last 4 or 5 years, to be honest, our debt management does not place us in a good place to be able to, in my view, to give that kind of headroom to the executive treasury and for Parliament.
Let me hear from Victor. As an SME consultant, what would that do then to businesses, especially even those that are owned by young people?
Like I said, if you look at the way SMEs are treated, and I've said it several times, they're always being battled. But for example, I'll give you an example. CBK indicated that starvation of credit to the SME led to a 0.4% reduction or contraction in the economy. And but this is 2017. My question is, how are they coming up with that number, knowing that we came from an election year, 2017, 2018? So you can't say the bad performance of SMEs is purely because of lack of financing. There are other issues. Issues to do with policy, issues to do with markets.
Right.
These are the fundamental reasons why SMEs are underperforming, and not necessarily credit.
But you have to admit our debt crisis as a nation will soon trickle down to those people at the bottom.
I agree, but the standpoint of an SME is this. These are the challenges that I'm facing. 1 is finance, 2 is markets, 3 is policies. And from an SME perspective, those are the things that I'm really much concerned about.
Honorable Kuria, you were against this from the onset, but what would you have prescribed as a better approach? Because economically speaking, is it better to have more money in circulation at an expensive interest rate, or less money in circulation at affordable rates?
I think, Trevor, the issue we're having is the focus of the economy. For some time now, this economy is just fiscal based on just spending, and where we believe that spending money solves all our problems, which it does not. Yeah, not all our problems can be solved with money. A lot of our problems can be solved by our focus. Do we want a private sector-led economy or a public sector-led economy? Because right now, what we've been having for some time is just a Keynesian sort of economy, whereby people think by just spending money out there, expanding budgets, that is going to solve the problem, which is important to spend. And public sector is a very important part of the engine of our economic growth. But more important is to look at SMEs, for example, and ask ourselves, what are those factors that are hampering SME growth? And have situations that are alive to our realities. Because right now, it's like, especially since 2016, since this cap came into place, the private sector sort of died. 2% growth when the rest of the economies, I mean, the overall GDP was 5% and above, but growth of the private sector was 2% and sub 2. It's because everybody said, okay, let's fold our arms and wait for government to do this. And meanwhile, at government, we were constrained by resource constraints because there just isn't money. And sorry to say that the immediately previous regime at Treasury, their buzzword, their pop-up was, let's borrow. Unfortunately for them, they didn't ask themselves whether they are borrowing from the domestic market and from the foreign market. And it's an unfair competition when you put an SME vis-a-vis a government. Because for you to invest, for a bank to invest in Treasury bond, they don't need a credit committee, they don't need to do appraisal, they don't need to do collateral. It's just a one-minute decision. It's a book entry actually at the central bank. So for you to bring those rates, the rate at which you lend to central bank or to government, and the rate which you give to SME, they are sort of close to each other at 12%. So I think that other than this cap, what we need to see is a deliberate surgery of what is ailing the private sector and let the private sector grow. When the private sector grows, there is not going to be an issue of interest rates because the market dynamics will take place. So I do hope that even people are looking at this expansion of the debt ceiling as a bargain. It could be a good thing if it's accompanied by, for example, in the international markets. In Japan, you have to pay a bank for a bank to accept your deposits because you have got negative interest rates. Money is so cheap out there. And our central bank has done a very good job really at the monetary side of view.
Yeah.
The exchange rate has not had some crazy, variations. So we have a historic opportunity to go to markets out there, borrow at very comfortable rates, continue building our infrastructure on, sub 5, really, below 5%. It is really possible. Yeah. But if these interest rates cap, and I did tell the outgoing CS for Treasury, if we remove these caps and then you follow us, if let's say for example the rates increase to 16%, 17%, it will make no effect if now Treasury follows us upstairs and starts competing on higher rates. It has to be, of course, accompanied by looking at the way we do our budget. Because if someone tells you that we do zero-based budgeting in this country, we do not. And that's an issue now as Parliament. We are going to be saying, stop. What people do is, how much do we budget last year? 1 billion. So where do we start this year? 1.1. Not about the needs. And tomorrow we have a very interesting discussion between our budget committee, where I sit, and cabinet secretary for treasury. Because one of the issues that I want to, put them to task is, can we start from zero, especially on our development budget? Say, forget what we did last year. What do we need today? And so
budget on a need basis.
Need basis, some discipline,
and available resources.
And don't just, people in government, their middle name is more. They want more. So it's time to stop them from that.
But what about the mama mboga that you deal with? Isn't this going to be having a negative impact on them? They did not have money. Now the money is available. It's too expensive.
But first of all, they were not even borrowing. You have to look at who is borrowing.
They were not borrowing because they didn't have the opportunity.
1 out of 20.
They're being outdone by
if
government.
You look at our current accounts vis-a-vis our credit accounts. For every one credit account, we have got 20 to 30 current accounts. Very few people borrow. So the people who people are holding Mama Boga hostage. Because Mama Boga is not borrowing. And we need to ask her, even before Mama Boga was not borrowing. But Mama Boga is an emotional hostage. So we need to free Mama Boga and let Mama Boga be. It's not big people like me and my friends here saying, Mama Boga, and it's us who are borrowing.
So Mama Boga is not borrowing from there. To Pambana Alietu.
And that's exactly what I was saying, is the SMEs are just being dangled.
By both sides, actually.
Yes. If you look at, for example, the way banks price their loans, the factors that they consider: one is cost of borrowing, second is profit, the third is risk. And this risk aspect is what they want to be, through the interest cap, to be unlocked. So it means that because SMEs are by nature risky, it means that they will always have very high interest. So I think and I think our banks to some degree are lazy in terms of innovation. Last month, I think the G7 released some $450 million USD through African Development Bank for women in business to Africa. Have banks looked at that option as a way of tapping into that funds to give to SMEs? So I think there is laziness in terms of them being creative in terms of serving this market, because there has to be an affirmative action to some degree if you're dealing with SMEs, because SMEs are not your standard person who has books of accounts, collateral, and come to the bank and apply for a loan. So I think the discussion of the interest rate from the SME perspective is to some degree an irrelevant discussion.
All right, so Robert, here is the concern then. We are in a debt as a country. If we do borrow, that means we're just going to increase more of our debt. If we do not borrow, our financial budget has a deficit. On top of that, maybe projects will be halted. What option does Treasury have?
One of the options is basically to create a conducive investment to promote more and more to attract more both domestic and international investors to invest. That will assist in alleviating part of the problem. And the government has also has come up with a Kenya investment policy that will basically look at such issues, how to not only attract but facilitate and retain investors. And when you talk of retaining investors, you're actually looking at such issues as the interest rates, issues that have been discussed, the interest rates, what is actually causing the high cost of production, looking at the cost of production, ease of doing business and all that. And from our end, that is what we'll vote for. The more resources being placed upon promoting investment and enablers, investment enablers, infrastructure and such and related facilities.
All right, more of this conversation when we come back from this short commercial break. Right now, we want to take a look at your feedback. 22422 is our SMS line at Citizen TV Kenya, where you can find us on Twitter at Trevor Mbija at Zinzi_K. Remember, this morning we're asking you, should the interest rate cap be repealed? Should the interest rate cap be repealed? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's take a look at your feedback right now. All right, Joseph, on SMS, you tell us that it should not be repealed because obviously banks will increase the rates to a higher percentage, including the current loans.
All right, you don't leave a name where you're texting from, but you say, no, I fail to understand how the president decided to side with the bankers against the common mwananchi who mostly depend on loans to boost their businesses. Expensive loans is automatically an increase in unemployment.
Okay. You don't say who you are and where you're watching from, but you say interest capping should not be repealed because the banks will continue charging high interest.
Comment from Elred says, no, this will be playing directly into the hands of the capitalists. Since the day it came into effect, banks have choreographed a campaign to prove that the cap was a failure. In fact, recently, banks offering mobile loans increased their monthly rates in order to put pressure on the parliament to accept to repeal the cap. There is lack of honesty in all this.
Okay. Still sticking on SMS, Nixon, good morning. You're watching all the way from Kindaruma. You say no, I think that the interest rate cap is an advantage to the majority. Unfortunately, it appears like a few very wealthy and selfish individuals are sabotaging the agreement.
All right, let's see what else you're saying on Twitter at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya at Zinzi_K. Nurifez says, banks, I'm twisting the government to remove rate cap, yet they are still making billions of profits. Is the president compromised as he has interests in the banking sector?
All right. At Mtukatana, you say, repeal the interest rate cap. It is hard to get loans out here.
Okay. Caleb Kimaiga says the capping is not the reason of non-liquid economy. This is due to overborrowing and massive corruption. We have the law, but implementation is the problem.
All right, sir, you say, why repeal the interest rate cap? Why not adjust the cap as per economic factors? This is here to regulate lender malpractice as well.
Okay, Engineer Lazaro, good morning. Say, yeah, banks should go back to the drawing board. They must now balance between making huge profits and well-being of their customers.
So just from your feedback, a lot of you are very concerned that if indeed it is removed, banks will have to increase their percentage. We'll get to hear from our panel on what they have to say about that after this short commercial break. Welcome back. Today's conversation is around the interest rate cap, and today we are asking you, should the interest rate cap rather be repealed? That's our Twitter poll question to you this morning. Should the interest rate cap be repealed? Would love to hear your thoughts on that one. Before we took the short commercial break, Owino, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because a lot of the feedback that is coming from Kenyans is the fear that indeed if it is removed, banks in return will misbehave and increase the percentage on rates. So then what's your answer to Kenyans, that fear that Kenyans have that if this is removed, my loan will just shoot up?
I mean, that fear is real. I think it's part of what drove members of parliament, because there was real pressure from their constituents to deal with that. I mean, even in the courts, we've seen significant abuses where interest rates were actually just recalculated without speaking to, or rather without reference to people who'd borrowed, and significant abuses over years by banks because they're dealing with people. Now, it might be selected banks, but the number and the frequency, as we've seen in the newspapers, is a bit too high. And that's what brings us back to the CBK. It is true, based on the role that the CBK played, and they've been very, very clear that the interest rates cap has failed to achieve the goals for which it is. Now, Victor says that that was bound to happen anyway because banks don't lend to small and micro enterprises to begin with. So to say that micro enterprises that's true, I think. But the thing is, the central bank's regulatory role in terms of fairness and to ensure that customers or other clients of banks are treated properly and that banks adhere to good business ethics and practices is something that it must take up. And perhaps Parliament should actually advise them to issue reports every so often, looking at how they settle complaints and to ensure that part of their overall oversight is to ensure that their inspection examines a few cases to ensure that abuse does not take place. Abuse takes place. Now, it's not necessarily every bank and everything else, but it's very, very clear that when you talk about a small Kenyan vis-a-vis banks, that difference in power and how negotiations are done for loans sometimes creates part of the reason why banks in Kenya are completely unpopular. Yeah. Unfair because there are too many of them and not all of them behave like that. But some banks are terrible when it comes to this practice. Yeah. So I understand the concern.
Yeah, Honorable Kuria, how do we mitigate that part? Because then there isn't much really you can do because banks will just decide and increase the rates, even if your lending was at 13 or 14%, but now that it's been repealed, shoots up to 24%. How can MPs cushion Kenyans from that?
Sadly, the way, to be honest with you, the way the memorandum has come, we cannot change the memorandum because we need to have 223 members sitting, you know. To get 10% of that at any one time in Parliament is normally a miracle. So I think, you know, there's no way, there's no conceivable way that Parliament is going to marshal the numbers to overturn the President's memorandum, or even to change it. Because even to put a dot or a comma needs 223 members. So it will and it is silent on that issue of the current stock. And it's something I've been discussing with colleagues and with people in the industry. How do we, and when I talk to banks tell us, trust us. But I feel not inclined to depend on their good Christian or Muslim inclinations. So as a matter of fact, I am contemplating moving to court purely on injunctive, fashion, because it is clearly a lacuna in the way that it's going to be that, yes, we have got the principle of no retroactive application of the law. Yeah. You cannot apply the law retroactively. But then someone can be mischievous about that. So I plan to go to court to seek a declaration that you cannot vary existing stocks of laws. And I think the court is our only avenue right now, because the way it has been done has left a lacuna. Having said that, I also do hope that two things, that one, the government, one of the main motivation for Treasury to do this was because we have been out of the standby facility from the IMF. Yeah. And now that IMF wanted to see these caps go, I hope they'll be able to avail the standby facility. And why is the standby facility important? Because it's before Treasury raids the banks or domestic markets for credit, at least they have got access to that standby facility, and that's why it is very important. So I do hope also that the temptation of Treasury to come to the domestic market will have a buffer through the IMF. But ultimately, Trevor, the only solution is to induce competition in the credit market, period. We need to have competition. And I think here I'm putting the ball right on the doorstep of central bank. Central bank needs to be more flexible in terms of, I know people have come with solutions which can even avail credit at 5%, but central bank has been very rigid. So I think the onus is on central bank, and I'll be looking at the central bank governor in the eye and tell him, Mr. Governor, you need to legeza kamba kidogo, so that we can be able to tap into SACCOs, for example, and give SACCOs a solution to be able to compete with the banks. We need to strengthen the capital markets. By the way, if you look at the big four for housing, we did offer some incentives for people who save for purposes of buying homes under what the act we passed called the Home Ownership Savings Plan. And that we said, if you save through banks, then you are entitled to some tax credits on the host, as we call it. But we assume that only banks have got solution. And I'm very proud. The only private members amendment in this finance bill was mine, whereby I put savings on instruments offered through the Capital Markets Authority to pari passu to be on the same level with savings in banks, because I want to start that conversation whereby we do not see that only banks have got solution to capital. And I think also we have got the wrong approach. We go to banks for credit. We don't go for capital. I've heard many people say we need to have business capital. Banks don't provide business capital. Capital markets, that's why it's called capital markets, provide business capital. So we are going to have a new movement, a new conversation towards availing business capital through capital markets, having very attractive and very practical, reasonable products and instruments being offered by our capital markets, so that people don't just think that if you start your small business of supplying to, I don't know, to Kenya Power or being a contractor at East African Breweries, you can only go to the bank. So we need to bring in the sophistication and the convenience, the flexibility that other markets do enjoy from capital markets as a counterweight to banks. And also, pin central bank to be more flexible. Even our telcos, for example.
Because some of those lenders are actually taking advantage of Kenyans and they end up on CRB, Shylocks, for example, mobile money lenders, for example. They are unregulated.
Yeah, that CRB issue is something we need to really look at, because, by the way, and that's what Kwame and I are saying about the credit scoring, whereby, why are we only rating people negatively and we are not rating them positively? If I'm a good borrower, what's my credit score? Because in this country, you only know about your rating when you are listed at CRB. It's like we are, we are purveyors of bad news. We are just accustomed to bad news.
So if you're a good borrower, there's no credit for it. But if you're
exactly. If you borrow and you're a good guy, nobody recognizes you. But the minute you default is when now we start hearing of. So in other markets, and I've worked in most of the international markets, you are rated both positively and negatively. So I need to work with my credit score. I need to come from KCB to Barclays Bank and tell them, I am 7.4. And Barclays Bank will not have any reason to doubt whether Standard Chartered Bank rated me correctly. We should have universal credit score so that we are able to rate people positively and negatively. I think what I'm saying is that we just need to look at our whole financial system and see how we move from there.
Now, allow me to stay on that a little bit, because now you've touched on the issue of lending rates, mobile lending rates, which has now become quite popular this year since January towards Kenyans from every economic class. Then how would you as Parliament decide to discipline some of these mobile lending rates, which have seen Kenyans on that CRB list?
By the way, you don't need to discipline them. You just need to give them alternatives. Because, discipline assumes that you are dealing with an irrational or unreasonable borrower. But borrowers are reasonable and borrowers make calculations. So if they know that, and that's why I'm talking about availability of more players in the market, of more avenues in the market. If the mobile guy knows I'll go to Equity Bank and I'll walk out with a loan within 48 hours. You remember when people are hawking loans all over? I want to see a return to that.
So, will increase of competition be the answer for Kenyans? Will that be what would sort of question Kenyans? Be it mobile lending rates or the banks?
Absolutely. Yes. It's just freedom of choice.
You see, right now, you have no choice. Whichever bank you go to, whatever your capability and your history of paying is, they can only charge you one rate. Or they'll claim that because the law has...
Even if both of you won't.
Precisely.
So the girl wants to get married, the boy wants to marry, but say, no, you can't.
Yes, you have to charge the rate that is in the law. Now, they have no reason to try and there's no competition at the credit level. There's no competition. But if this rate is completely taken out, banks might have, and government stops borrowing, and the central bank does its responsibility in ensuring ethical practice, then obviously banks will consider when they're lending the same 100 shillings between Victor and I, they may look at other factors. And if they decide both of us deserve, and I am a better borrower, then obviously that will factor in. So this moment, there's no reason for them to compete at all in terms of customers.
So, Robert, even at the end of the day, the last time that CBK did a cutting rate was last year in May, from 9.5 to about 9%. Do you foresee them doing so again next month?
Yeah, the possibility does arise. But as I mentioned, the bottom line is we should remove the interest rates and allow competition. Yeah, we allow free competition. We are not in the business of going back to controls. Let us look at the issues that force the interest rates to go up without necessarily having that punitive measure of having that rate. But I see the rate. I believe the rate may go down.
So my concern is, Ken Invest is looking at championing investment in counties and nationally as well. What is the strategy for this, considering that capital is quite inaccessible?
Okay, one key strategy. This year, the government approved a Kenya investment policy in April.
Yeah.
And one area you see, right from independence, the government has been very strict in coming up with policies and strategies to promote investment. The first being the Foreign Investment Promotion Act, which was passed 1964, barely a year after independence. So you can see the seriousness. Various sessional papers have come up. Various programs have come up, manufacturing under bond, export processing zone, recently special economic zones. And in the same vein, various organizations have come up to support the framework. And to add on to that, we have the counties that are also promoting investment. So we have a lot of organizations promoting investment. And the only setback is that the laws and regulations are not similar. So at times it brings contradicting and conflicting procedures being followed. A lot of duplication of efforts, and a lot of wastage of resources. You may have seen a lot of organizations, both public in the public sector, promoting investment. Yeah. It's a waste of resources. So with the policy, we shall come up with a centralized approach through the Ministry of Industry and Trade and Cooperatives. We have come up with ours is to have a single harmonized policy that will guide the process of investments to avoid all that duplication and narrow down. We don't want a lot of entries causing confusion among the investors. It will also, the other issue is to anchor the role of the private sector in investment.
Okay.
And you also mentioned about the issue of counties. We also, on the same day, next week, 30th October, we're also launching a county investment handbook, because different counties are endowed with different capabilities. They have various competitive advantages and comparative advantages. We'd like them to bring that all together in what we are calling county investment units. They promote the areas that are unique to their jurisdiction in conjunction with the regional economic blocks. That feeds into the national agenda, which basically helps to now position the country as improve the country's ranking, okay, which we hope will go up in doing.
So they should play to their strengths, essentially. That's what you're saying, both counties and nationally.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly to their strengths.
Okay, Victor, SMEs growth, you say that they're used as a scapegoat. What would you like to see if the conditions were made at the best possible condition for SMEs to grow? What would you like to see?
I think the role of government is to create a conducive business environment for all players in the economy. But before I forget, even in the memorandum of the president, he mentioned that there is the rise of Shylocks and unregulated lenders.
Yes.
I'm assuming a lot of fintech companies have been lumped here. And for me, it begs the question, why would a central bank or government take a position against another? In this sense, they are saying banks are better placed to give better service than fintechs, which have played a huge role in financial inclusion to Mama Mbogas. If you go to Kikomba, for example, today, Most probably, a Mamboga selling nyanya would borrow 1,000 shillings from Tala or wherever and repay in the evening. They are not complaining, even if it's expensive, because they're not being asked for collateral, they're not being asked for documents, they're not being asked for anything. So that's a player that you cannot just sideline and say, this is bad, let's focus on financial institutions. Second is, I feel that the conversation around financing to SMEs needs to move away from a bank-only conversation to other financial players. Yeah, so for instance, an equity investor, either as an angel investor or private equity fund, does not have incentive to set up their fund in Kenya because of taxes. So what is currently happening, they would set up their business in Seychelles or whatever and come in Kenya and invest and ensure that the person they're investing in has a corresponding account outside, because they're trying to avoid there are a lot of the murky tax policies around. Okay. So I think that conversation has to be broader. How can we include other players? Because even if, for example, if I started my business today and I walk to a bank, chances I will not be able to access credit, because what I need at that point is patient capital. I need a grant. I need to prove my business first before I reach the stage where I go to banks. Businesses that go to banks are always what we call medium enterprises. People who've done business for a while, they've accumulated capital, they have their corporate governance in check, then they can be able to approach a bank. But right now, banks are being deemed as the silver bullet for all our business problems, which I don't think is right.
No, there's something that one of our viewers brought up, loans and unemployment. I'm not sure they really correlate, but we've seen a lot of unemployment state right now. There's a lot of unemployment among the youth, but also now people are being laid off in their thousands. From an economic perspective, what's really going on? Because there's a lot of speculation. The money is being held up by the people up there. There's no trickle down. The economy is bad. What's really going on from the research you've conducted?
Well, okay, first, I think one of the things people need to understand is that our declared unemployment rates are just like between 9 and 10%, which doesn't gel with the reality. But what that tells you is that in our country, life is so tough that many people actually have to do many things. So they're not necessarily unemployed, but their employment does not pay them enough. So they have a job.
Side hustle.
Yes, precisely. They have a job, or they have two jobs or three things that they're doing, selling one thing in the morning, another in the afternoon, and then farming perhaps over the weekends, partly because a single job will not be there. So that's the reality. What we need to think about then is how do we make, and in some of the enterprises that they do, whether they are a farmer or they're selling something else, they require some credit. And that's what Victor says. They will go to a Shylock if a bank will not provide. And often they know they will not because of what the restraints are. But the general trend in the economy now is obviously, I think with some layoffs in the formal markets, you know, some farms, the conditions are too harsh for them. So those ones are leaving. And then, of course, there are also other farms where we made a direct policy decision. So, for instance, the 400 people who lost very good wages and jobs because our national ethos is that we don't like people to bet, unfortunate in my view. So some of them are going to close down. Now, whatever it might have been, regulatory factors can actually also lead to loss of jobs. So part of it is how is the environment shaped towards helping people to create many more jobs. But our real problem is that many medium and micro enterprises are not growing so that it comes from a one person or a one family enterprise to another one. And that's not something that you necessarily solve by throwing money at it. It's just a structure. As Moses said, for instance, we are so bank-centric that you think that when it comes to finances and helping people with financial access, it has to be through a bank. Maybe not. But let me come to the question of fintech and Shylocks. It's true that some digital tools are now being used to lend money to people. I personally am not opposed to them because I think a Kenyan who understands that if I borrow 2,000 shillings today, at the end of the week I'll pay 20%, it might be high. It might be high. But this is not to be compared to a regular loan for the reason that this is short term. Obviously, the conditions under which it is lent, and definitely if you go to a bank and by the time you fill the papers, 2 months are over and everything else. I think the Shylocks that the president was talking about, in my view, are the kind of people who come to your house, take a TV, you give them money, and then they start to charge you 50% every week, and if you don't, something really bad could happen to you. That is illegal, and it should stay so. But the reason Shylocks exist, again, in my view, is because there is no option that Kenyans have, even for emergencies. So often, even if you suffer an emergency, you need to solve something, your average bank still tells you to wait several number of weeks so that they can do all those other things. So those regulations themselves lend themselves to the fact that someone around your store, I mean, or rather around your block will lend you money and start charging you 20% per week.
Right. Honorable Kuria, let me rope into the conversation. We know he has clearly painted for us a picture of how business has been this past year alone. We've seen a number of businesses having to close shop, young people being laid off week in, week out. There's always a certain company that has to let go of its employees. At the end of the day, how much blame do we put on the interest rate cap for a poor or unhealthy economy?
Well, it's just part of it, but really our biggest problem is our mentality is that investors need Kenya more than Kenya needs investors. That is, I'm happy with my good friend, Mr. Bure is here. We've had this discussion for more than a decade now. It is not, investors are not short of choices. And the minute we do realize that as a country, you know, when you travel, you know, the other week I was in Taiwan, you know, just trying to see how other countries are creating jobs through the textile industry, through the apparel industry, and you just get angry. You just get angry at our country and at our, you know, at our policy makers. And I think also is, with all due respect, that we are a bunch of villagers without, you know, global. We don't know about possibilities on a global scale. We don't know what is happening there. We just see scarcity, not abundance. We just see impossibilities, not possibilities.
But Kuria, you're one of those policymakers.
And most of these policymakers benchmark trips a lot. What do they learn from that?
I'm just saying, you know, as we're going to Parliament to pass laws and create an environment which they need, but ultimately this stops with the executive. It stops with the executive.
When you say the executive, you mean the presidency?
The whole government, the executive is wide, it's not just
so some of the CSs
inept
in your
even undersecretary, even a guy in charge of I don't know, licensing and that. So let's not get preoccupied with the presidency. Because unless we change the whole, I think as a whole country we need to be close for innovation. We are taken to Malaysia or Singapore, then we come back.
You do not start to the president. Essentially, he's the one who appoints the CSs you're talking about.
For example, if you have to look at this from the big picture, we passed the Special Economic Zone Act. We have got CESA. We have got the authority in place. How many have we actions? Do you know today, people complain about high tax rates. One of the reasons people are running away. Do you know if you are manufacturing under the Special Economic Zones Authority, your corporate tax rate falls from 30% to 10%. Your VAT becomes zero. Your excise becomes zero. Your dividends becomes tax exempt. You get 150% investment allowance on capital, machinery, and buildings. So we have, as Parliament, we have done that. We've given all that. Then we give to these guys in the executive. They do nothing. And then the following day, you hear about companies relocating to other countries. And you feel like you want to be like Jesus and get to the temple and, you know, turn tables there, because it is very, very, very annoying. And maybe part of the motivation why I want to be president.
So the issue here is
declaring your president.
No, not really, so but I am just saying
so
that
do you think some of this,
it is very annoying that we have passed some of these incentives that would keep jobs. And by the way, if my tagline, my slogan is manufacture or perish.
But before you become president, what have you done as member of parliament to make sure that you're making the economy
different
policies? We have passed all the laws.
So do you think some of these CSs are inept?
We have passed all the laws that we do. But these people and these
should some of the CSs
that
go home?
Question. This is a guy who is in charge of taking advantage of the laws that we pass to create a good environment for manufacturers, for investors to come in. So maybe that's not a question for me, that's for Mr. Bure to say, now, what have you done with the wonderful pieces of legislation that you've passed that can transform this country? You know Sri Lanka, a war-torn country, 5 million people working on textile alone. And you know, we talk about the apparel market in the US, under AGOA. The whole industry is $370 billion, out of which $100 billion they import. That's the size of a Kenyan GDP. You know, if we just take the whole import as a country, we just double our GDP. What do we get as Kenya, as Africa, even with AGOA? 0.0034%. Yes, we have EPZ, we have all these things that we keep passing. What more can we do?
Robert, we have to go on a commercial break, but I want you to quickly respond to what Honorable Kuria has said. Or rather has asked. They've done the laws, what have you been able to do with what they've done?
Yes, actually I agree with him. There's a lot that has been done, and as I said, we're having a policy, but one issue to also note, before we cannot blame maybe anybody. Investment, promotion, facilitation, and retention is a responsibility for all operatives, whether public or private sector, and not a select few. So that is why with the policy coming up, we'd like to, under the policy we're having what we call a National Investment Council, headed by the President, high-level public sector and private sector, so that when decisions are made, we look at their impact. So for example, things like the argument on interest rates, Parliament should not have just, they wouldn't have just come up with a cap. It will have been discussed and find out alternative ways of doing that. And the same thing, we undertake quite a lot of activities, investment missions. We have what we call a one-stop center to ease processes where we have all organizations who interface with key organizations that interface with investors in the day-to-day operations are headquarters at our place. That is easing the process. And the other issue, investment promotion is complex. We have over 200 investment promotion agencies in over 160 countries, and they are competing for investment from the same locations. So even when the government makes policies, we now need to sit together and see the Africa Rising phenomenon. All countries, that is why we are now competing. The issue of Kenya is a regional hub. It's a stereotype that is always there. We're the greatest, we're the regions where that one has to go. Everyone has to tighten their seatbelts.
So we're not as great as we make it sound.
We are great, very great, but others are also coming up. Africa is rising, as I said. So we need to tighten our seatbelts.
Okay.
And when you mean tightening our seatbelts, do you mean we need to be more, I want to say selfish, but as a nation, as a nation, we need to be more selfish with who we are allowed to invest in?
Or we need to have better incentives?
Yes, better incentives, and also targeting investments that reflect the development aspirations of the country, not just any kind of investments. Yeah, the ones that reflect our aspirations in line with the Big Four agenda and Vision 2030.
Not just accept any investment.
Not just any.
Right. Okay, before we take that commercial break, let's take a look at your SMSs and tweets and what you're saying.
All right. Mutembe from Meru on SMS says, maintain the current interest rate regulation. It is suitable for the common man. Loans nowadays are affordable to everyone because the interests are under control. When the cap is changed to have bank regulate interest rates, loans will be available only to the rich and the government. And you continue to say, if SMEs, oh no, that's a different person.
Yeah, this is now Njoroge. You need to skip Njoroge's feedback. Njoroge, good morning. You say if SMEs are a risk factor, why are the banks crying that they have realized a downfall? Why can the cap remain and the banks continue to deal with the government if that is where they feel there is security? Those panelists are not being sincere.
Martin Kurere says, talk of humor. Why should we quest for the answers concerning insufficiency of funds in terms of billing? It's very apparent that Kenya's economy was suffocated a decade ago and is in its ailing state. We should pay attention to this.
All right. John, all the way from Homa Bay, you say, for the first time, I have witnessed a politician passionate about need-based budgeting from Mashinani. As an anchor to public financing, kudos to Mheshimiwa. Great discussion.
All right. Dr. Samuel Okia from Butere says, there is no need for interest rate cap. Kenya is not a closed economy.
Let's take a look at your tweets at Citizen TV Kenya, Trevor Beach at Zinzi_K is where you can find us. Brian15, you say interest rate cap has had a ripple effect to the economy since commercial banks now lend to government T-bills as opposed to citizens, which they say is risk. Hence, emergence of digital borrowers and Shylocks charging exorbitant rates. Yep.
All right. Shonko Andrew says, if the bill goes through, it will dent the SMEs, which are now the only hopes of a country that is on the verge of increasing unemployment rates.
Okay, Engineer Lazarus, good to see you again. You said the president should sit down with the economic advisors and the bank's management so as to come up with an amicable solution. Otherwise, scrapping interest rate without consultations would kill many banks.
All right, Just BT says, if the Kenyan money system was functional and trustworthy, factoring companies would be beneficial for small businesses. Factoring companies purchase your invoices, funds you at the fee, then bills the creditors. This is how my business has been funded over the years. No loans, just cash flow that keeps the business going.
Governor 254, you say finance has made it difficult to progress and provide quality services. For example, many such micro businesses, as some call them, deal with primary products and readily available cheap resources.
All right. Let's take a quick break now. When we come back, I'd like to hear from the legislator, Honorable Moses Kuria, how this issue of unemployment and people losing jobs, what are the solutions to that? Because I'm sure even his constituents ask him that question every time. What does he say to them? He will tell us when we come back.